I'm 33 years old, and I manage inventory operations for a hospital pharmacy network outside Indianapolis. Every shipment and missing item has to come from somewhere, and I have spent years learning not to trust a story until the details line up. That habit mattered more than I knew the night my husband told me our daughter was not his. I had no idea he had prepared the paperwork. Derek texted me before I left work and said I needed to come home because everyone had to be there. I thought something had happened with his father's estate or the promotion he had been talking about. Instead, I opened our front door and saw my parents, his mother, and his sister Jenna sitting at the table. Sophie was in the living room watching cartoons, unaware that 6 adults were waiting to discuss whether she belonged to the family. Derek had a folder open in front of him. He pushed a DNA report toward me and said, "She's not my child." For a second I smiled because the sentence made so little sense that I thought I had misunderstood him. Then his mother asked how long I had been lying, and my mother asked if there was something I needed to tell them. I told Derek the report had to be wrong, but he was already reaching for another stack of papers. There was a separation agreement and a document connected to the Lawson family trust, asking me to acknowledge Sophie had no biological claim to the family property. Derek said signing now would keep Sophie out of a fight and let us handle everything privately. I looked at the pages, then at him, and asked the only question that made sense. If you just learned she isn't yours, why is her trust paperwork already prepared? Derek did not answer. The room went so quiet I could hear Sophie laughing at something on television. Then the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, a man I didn't know was standing there with a DNA collection case in his hand. The man introduced himself as Martin Keating and said Howard Bell, the trustee, had asked him to complete a verified DNA collection for Derek and Sophie. He carried a case and spoke in the calm way people do when they expect paperwork, not a family confrontation. Derek looked annoyed rather than surprised, which told me he knew Martin was coming. I stepped aside and let him in. Martin noticed the report on the table immediately. He asked Derek if that was the same test he had submitted to Howard to change the trust records. Derek said yes and told him there was no reason to make this more complicated. Martin picked up the first page, read it twice, then looked at Derek. "Before we collect anything tonight," he said, "can you tell me why the sample listed under Sophie's name appears to come from an adult male?" Nobody spoke. Martin explained that the information attached to the sample did not match what he would expect from a 5-year-old girl. Whatever had been tested, he could not treat that report as proof about Sophie. Derek blamed the laboratory. Martin did not argue or accuse him of anything. He only said the report could not be used to change a minor beneficiary's status if the sample identity was uncertain. Carol turned toward Derek and asked how he had collected Sophie's sample. He said he had used a cheek swab while she was asleep. I remembered that night because Derek had told me he was working late and did not come home until after midnight. When I said that, his face changed for half a second. Martin offered to collect fresh sample from both of them right then, under documented conditions. Derek said Sophie was tired and suggested doing it the following week. That was the first moment I stopped worrying that the test might somehow be right. I started worrying that Derek already knew it was wrong. I took Sophie to my parents' house without signing anything, but I still could not breathe easily. My mother waited until Sophie was asleep, then asked, "What if the second test says the same thing?" The next morning, I met April Donnelly in an office above a dental practice. I explained the DNA report, the family meeting, and every reason I knew Derek had to be wrong. April listened, then asked me to stop trying to prove I was innocent for a minute. She wanted to know what Derek needed me to sign. I showed her the separation agreement and the trust acknowledgement. April read the second document twice and told me the DNA issue and the trust issue were not the same thing, even if Derek had presented them that way. The acknowledgement would have me agree that Sophie had no biological claim to property held by the Lawson family trust. That was when I stopped asking whether Derek believed the test and started asking what he gained if everyone else believed it. I had never paid much attention to the trust because it came from Derek's father, and I considered it his family's business. April explained that the trust held 14 acres near a lake and 3 rental cabins, and Sophie had her own protected interest as a descendant. A developer had offered to buy the property, but Howard could not simply erase a minor beneficiary because the adults wanted a faster closing. If Sophie came off the trust, more money would flow directly to Derek and Jenna. April warned me that motive was not proof, and I understood the difference. A legally collected DNA test was scheduled at an independent clinic, but Derek postponed once for a work trip, and again because he said he was sick. Howard froze any change to Sophie's beneficiary status until the testing was finished. Then Jenna called and said she had only just learned the developer's offer had a deadline. She sounded shaken when she admitted that removing Sophie would increase her share too. Jenna told me Derek had been pushing Howard for weeks to simplify the trust before the developer walked away. Then she forwarded a message he had sent her 3 weeks earlier. It said, "If Sophie comes off the trust, we can finally close this without Howard babysitting every dollar." I read it twice and finally understood that the DNA accusation had not started with our marriage. It had started with the property. Martin could not tell me whose sample had been submitted under Sophie's name, but he documented every problem with the private report. April requested the testing service preserve the account records, kit information, and submission history connected to Derek's test. The kit had been purchased with Derek's card, and the account was registered in his name. The second sample was labeled as Sophie, but the genetic information did not match a 5-year-old girl. The answer came from Jenna. She remembered a family barbecue about a month earlier when Derek brought an ancestry kit and joked that everyone should learn where the Lawson family came from. Derek's 29-year-old cousin, Caleb, had used one of the swabs because he thought it sounded fun. Caleb said Derek took the kit home afterward and promised to register it for him. April did not let me jump to conclusions. She contacted Caleb, explained what had happened, and asked whether he would voluntarily provide a comparison sample. He agreed. When the results came back, the profile attached to Sophie's name was far more consistent with Caleb than with my daughter. Suddenly, the strange report on my dining room table had a real person behind it. Derek said the testing company must have mixed up the samples. He kept repeating that he had followed the instructions and had no idea how Caleb's DNA could have ended up in Sophie's file. April told me not to argue with him because the official test was already scheduled. We did not need his explanation before we had verified results. This time, Derek showed up. Sophie sat beside me at the clinic, swinging her feet while a technician collected the samples under documented conditions. A few days later, April called and asked if I was somewhere I could sit down. The verified test confirmed Derek was Sophie's biological father. I thought I would feel relieved, but I started crying instead. I had never doubted who Sophie's father was. What hurt was knowing that a laboratory had been needed to prove something Derek had known. Every morning he packed her lunch, and every night she called him Dad. The question was no longer whether the first test was wrong. It was how far Derek had gone to make it wrong. Once the verified test confirmed Derek was Sophie's father, April went back to the documents he had wanted me to sign that first night. The separation agreement was bad enough, but the trust acknowledgement mattered more. Inside it was a clause saying, I accepted that Sophie had no claim to Lawson family property and would not challenge any change to her beneficiary status. I had almost treated that paragraph like legal clutter. April explained what Derek stood to gain if I had signed it. The developer's offer on the lake property had an expiration date, and Howard could not move quickly while Sophie's protected interest remained unresolved. Derek had also committed to a luxury condo using a short-term bridge loan based on money he expected from the sale. He had spent against money he did not have yet. That changed everything for me. Derek did not need the private DNA report to survive a courtroom challenge. He only needed it to frighten me, embarrass me in front of everyone, and make signing feel safer than fighting. The report was not the goal. My signature was, if I signed, Sophie's interest could be treated as something I had agreed not to contest, and Derek could push the sale forward without me standing in the way. If I refused, Howard would keep asking questions. The verified testing would happen, and the closing could be delayed long enough to put Derek's bridge loan under pressure. He had created an emergency for me because he was already living inside one of his own. I finally understood why that night had felt rehearsed. Still, understanding it did not make the next weeks easy. Legal bills were growing. I was changing shifts to keep my job steady, and Sophie kept asking why her dad was not calling at bedtime. My mother told me maybe I should settle quietly for us and keep the family from becoming a public mess. For one exhausted evening, I almost agreed. I told April I could walk away from money if it meant Sophie could stop living inside this fight. She looked at the acknowledgement again and asked me one question. Would you still sign this if Sophie were old enough to read it herself? I said no before she finished. And that was when I knew I was done helping Derek solve his problem with our daughter's name. Once Derek realized I was not signing anything, his tone changed. The anger disappeared from his messages, and suddenly he wanted to talk about healing, Sophie, and how much pressure he had been under since his father died. He said he had reacted badly and that the developer deal had made him panic. But he still would not admit that the DNA sample had been switched. A few days later, Jenna called me and said she had asked Howard to freeze any distribution or beneficiary change until everything was reviewed. That mattered because she would have received more money too if Sophie had been removed from the trust. Carol was furious with her and said she was helping me destroy a family deal. Jenna told me she would rather lose money than profit from something she no longer trusted. Then, Caleb found the receipt from the ancestry kit Derek had brought to the barbecue. The serial number matched the kit connected to the private paternity package. Derek said he must have mixed the kits up by accident. But April told me we did not need to argue about explanations anymore. The records were beginning to tell the story without his help. The biggest problem for Derek was the timeline. April obtained a message he had sent Howard before the night he confronted me. In it, Derek wrote that once Megan signs the acknowledgement, there will not be a minor beneficiary issue holding up closing. He had been talking about removing Sophie from the trust before he claimed the DNA report had shocked him. Derek called me that evening and said he never wanted to lose Sophie. He said he believed the paperwork only needed to reflect what the test showed. I asked why the trust documents had been prepared before he supposedly knew the result. He went quiet, then accused me of being willing to destroy the family over property. I told him I was not the one who removed our daughter from it. He ended the call without answering. By then, mediation had been scheduled, and Derek still seemed convinced exhaustion would eventually make me choose silence. What he did not understand was that every time he changed his explanation, I trusted him less. For the first time, I stopped wondering which version of Derek was real. I started watching what each version needed me to do next anyway. Mediation took place in a conference room with Derek, me, our attorneys, and the mediator. April did not begin with accusations. She asked Derek to confirm 3 dates: when he received the DNA result, when he asked Howard to remove Sophie from the trust, and when the acknowledgement was drafted. Derek answered, then slowed down. April placed the documents side by side. The request to change Sophie's beneficiary status had been sent before the date on the DNA report Derek claimed had shocked him. The acknowledgement had also been prepared before he told me anything was wrong. Derek stared at the pages and said he had only been preparing for every possibility. Then April showed the serial number from Caleb's ancestry kit, the records tying it to the private paternity package, and Sophie's test confirming Derek was her father. Derek said he must have mixed up the kits and never meant for anyone to be hurt. His attorney asked whether he was certain that was his explanation. Derek looked at me instead of answering. I asked the question I had been carrying for weeks. Did you ever believe Sophie wasn't yours? Derek said the developer deadline was closing in. Howard would not move without the beneficiary issue resolved. and he believed the private report would settle things long enough to close. The room went silent because he had admitted what the test had been for. He had not said he switched the sample. He did not need to. His explanation showed that finding the truth about Sophie had never been the point. The report was a tool to clear an obstacle before the sale. His attorney asked for a break. When we returned, Derek withdrew the demand that I sign away Sophie's trust interest, and the settlement proposal was removed. Howard confirmed Sophie's beneficiary rights would remain protected, and the developer deal would not proceed under Derek's proposed structure. Jenna said she would not accept any increase created by removing Sophie. I did not feel victorious sitting there. I felt tired, but clear. Derek had spent weeks changing his story, and in the end, the one thing he could not change was the timeline he had created himself. 9 months later, Derek and I were divorced. Sophie remained a protected beneficiary of the family trust, and Howard made sure nothing connected to the property could change without protecting her share. The developer deal moved forward under different terms. Derek had to deal with his bridge loan using his own money, not Sophie's future. He did not lose everything, and I never needed him to. He kept working, although he left the insurance company where he had built his career. Our parenting plan gave him time with Sophie because what he did to me did not erase the fact that she loved her father. We used a co-parenting app and kept every conversation focused on school, health, pickup times, and whatever Sophie needed. Carol apologized months later. She told me she had wanted to believe Derek was protecting the family property, so she stopped asking whether he was protecting the people in it. My mother apologized too for asking what I had done instead of asking if I was okay. I accepted both apologies, but I did not pretend trust returned the moment someone said sorry. My father and I had a conversation. He said he thought staying calm that first night would keep things from getting worse. I told him that sometimes being neutral only makes the person standing alone feel more alone. He nodded, and we left it there. The last moment I think about happened at Sophie's school performance. Derek sat several rows away, and when Sophie found us in the audience, she waved at us before turning back to sing. She did not know that her father had once reduced her to a line on a document, so a property deal could move faster. I hope she never has to carry that knowledge. What I learned was simpler. When someone demands a life-changing decision while you are shocked, ashamed, or afraid, do not only ask whether their story is true. Ask why they need your answer right now. If you have ever faced that kind of pressure, share what helped you slow down. And share, and subscribe if this story stayed with you today.